It began with a sound so sharp, so violent, that even veteran ground crews froze where they stood. The sudden shriek of a piston engine pushing itself beyond the red line, coughing smoke that shimmered like liquid fire under the morning sun. The men in oil-stained uniforms had seen engines pushed hard before, but this was different. The roar wasn't angry. It was alive. It was as if the machine itself had woken up with a hunger that shouldn't exist, its metallic heart pounding faster than the blueprint said was possible. Pilots turned their heads, engineers looked on in disbelief, and one man, a mechanic whose ideas everyone had once dismissed as lunacy, simply smiled. Because what they were hearing was history's most dangerous gamble, a fuel mix so volatile it could melt pistons, warp valves, and send an aircraft skyward at speeds no one dared believe a piston-engine fighter could reach. He called it a correction to physics. The others called it suicide. But as the fighter leapt off the runway and tore into the sky, the impossible seemed to bow, just for a moment, to the will of human invention. The year was deep in the heart of World War II. Allied pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. The Luftwaffe's latest interceptors climbed higher and faster, their cannons tearing through the skies. Every Allied base was haunted by the same bitter question: how do you fight an enemy that can outclimb, outdive, and outrun you? The official answer was to wait for new aircraft, but time was a luxury the front lines didn't have. On a rain-slick airstrip somewhere in England, one mechanic decided waiting was over. His name would be buried under layers of classified reports for decades, but among pilots he was known simply as the Mixer. He wasn't an officer, wasn't even a trained engineer. Just a man obsessed with combustion, ratios, and the untamed violence of internal engines. When others saw a limit, he saw a dare. And that dare came in the form of a simple idea. What if a fighter could burn fuel not meant for its engine, not gasoline, but something that could ignite the very air it breathed? He spent nights alone in the hangar, armed with nothing but grease-covered hands, a battered slide rule, and the kind of stubborn faith that borders on madness. He mixed aviation fuel with methanol, benzene, and trace additives scavenged from nearby depots. Substances meant for experimental rockets, not piston engines. Every mechanic who saw him warned him he'd blow himself up. He didn't listen. He adjusted carburetors by feel, tuned timing gears by ear, and watched flame patterns through exhaust manifolds until the colors told him what the instruments couldn't. When the first test engine fired, it shook the hangar like thunder. Flames shot from the exhaust ports in long, bright tongues, and the fuel mixture burned so clean it left almost no residue. What he had done, without formal equations or government approval, was create a chemical cocktail capable of delivering explosive combustion at altitudes where ordinary fuel froze. It was a solution born not in a lab, but in desperation and genius. The first pilot to test the insane mix was a young lieutenant with nerves of steel and a death wish to match. His Mustang was modified in secret, stripped of standard fuel lines and fitted with reinforced valves to handle the volatile brew. On the morning of the test flight, he sat in the cockpit while the mechanic leaned through the open panel, whispering last-minute adjustments like a priest offering confession before battle. The plane rolled down the runway, the propeller a blur, the engine howling beyond its limits. And then, at the halfway mark, something miraculous happened. The Mustang didn't just take off. It exploded upward, climbing faster than any piston aircraft had ever climbed before. The mechanic watched through the haze, mouth slightly open, as the plane punched through the clouds like a bullet through silk. The lieutenant's voice crackled over the radio, strained but exhilarated. "She's holding! She's actually holding!" Within minutes, the aircraft had surpassed every recorded climb rate in Allied logs. But the real revelation came when the pilot dove. Normally, a high-speed dive risked engine seizure from overspeed or air starvation. Yet the modified Mustang held steady, her controls taut, her airframe humming like it was born for this violence. Ground instruments recorded speeds approaching the edge of what the propeller's tips could physically withstand. To everyone watching, it seemed the plane was laughing at gravity itself. When the Mustang finally landed, smoke curling from the cowlings, the crowd ran forward. The mechanic, still calm, simply removed his goggles and murmured, "That's how you make an engine drink, Lightning." But this was only the beginning. The command structure caught wind of the experiment, and like all dangerous miracles, it divided the ranks. Some officers saw salvation, an edge against German super fighters. Others saw suicide in a can. Tests began in secret airfields under code names that barely hinted at their purpose. The mixture's behavior was unpredictable. At sea level, it offered only modest gains, but at altitude, where air thinned and engines starved, it came alive. The mixture's oxygen-rich properties compensated for the rarefied air, delivering complete combustion where other fuels sputtered out. It was, in effect, synthetic oxygen in liquid form. The cost? An engine lifespan measured in hours, not missions. Yet to the men flying into dogfights, hours were enough. Rumors spread faster than orders. Pilots whispered about planes that could climb past 40,000 feet and dive at speeds that shattered gun cameras. Enemies began reporting strange encounters. Allied fighters that appeared from nowhere, struck with impossible precision, then vanished before radar could catch them. The Luftwaffe dismissed them as exaggerated sightings. Intelligence analysts called them fuel ghosts. But among Allied crews, the truth was spreading. The insane mix worked. Every pilot who used it described the same sensation, as though the aircraft had shed its weight, its inertia, its mortal limits. The engine's vibrations softened. The controls felt lighter. The world seemed to move slower. They weren't flying through air anymore. They were carving through it. One particular mission would etch the legend forever. A bomber formation returning from deep inside enemy territory was ambushed by high-altitude interceptors. The Mustangs escorting them were outnumbered, climbing desperately to intercept, and running out of both fuel and time. Then, over the radio, a calm voice, switching to mix. Within seconds, the fighters surged forward like unleashed predators, closing the gap in moments that should have taken minutes. One Mustang dove, another climbed, and the German formation shattered. The pilots' after-action reports read like fiction, maneuvers that defied both physics and training manuals. One pilot claimed he performed a 180-degree turn in less than 5 seconds at 400 miles per hour. Engineers later said that was impossible. The pilot just smiled. So's this fuel. As victories mounted, so did paranoia. The mix was too volatile for mass use. Several test planes had already exploded mid-air. But even those losses couldn't stop the spread. Pilots began hoarding the concoction, trading recipes across bases, modifying ratios like alchemists. The mechanic who started it all was summoned for interrogation, or promotion, depending on who you asked. When questioned about the formula, he shrugged and said, "You can't write it down. You feel it." The officers didn't know whether to court-martial him or decorate him. What they didn't realize was that his formula wasn't just chemistry, it was art. Each batch had to be tuned to the specific engine, to the altitude, to the humidity, even to the personality of the pilot flying it. It was symbiosis, man, machine, and madness, perfectly aligned. And so, through a haze of danger and secrecy, the Allies' deadliest advantage was born not from laboratories or committees, but from a man who refused to accept the rules of physics as final. His fuel burned hotter, cleaner and faster than anything before it. It turned ordinary piston engines into near-jet performers. And though few ever knew his name, every victory credited to impossible speed carried his fingerprint. The war's balance began to shift, not overnight, but perceptibly, like a storm changing direction. Somewhere, deep in the heart of the hangars, the mechanic watched pilots soar into the heavens and thought, if we can do this with fuel, imagine what comes next. The airbase that had once dismissed him as a reckless tinkerer now operated under a strange electric tension, as though every tool, every wrench, every plane was waiting for the next impossible thing to happen. What began as a whispered experiment had become a classified obsession, a fever that infected both pilots and engineers alike, spreading from one airfield to another, from England to Italy to the Pacific. The mechanic, That ghost of genius whose fuel formula changed the sound of war, found himself summoned not by the brass hats of bureaucracy, but by the men who fought, those who risked everything each time they throttled up into the sky. They didn't want lectures. They wanted results. And so he became something else, a legend with grease under his nails and danger in his veins. They said he could smell combustion ratios the way others smelled rain, that he could tell the health of an engine by the color of its exhaust. He never corrected them. Truth was, he'd stopped thinking of himself as a man. He was a conduit between metal and fire, between the earth that bound humanity and the air that promised freedom. The hangars glowed at night, lit not by lamps but by the restless glow of test fires and the eerie blue flicker of ignition trials. The smell of burnt oil, alcohol, and steel filled the air like incense. Each new experiment came with the same haunting uncertainty. Would this be the one that burned cleaner, climbed faster, or would it end in an explosion that scattered engine parts across the runway? One wrong drop of methanol, one mistimed spark, and the entire operation could vanish in a storm of fire. Yet again and again, the mechanic defied logic. His notes were cryptic, not equations or blueprints, but strange poetry scrawled across notebooks. Fire loves rhythm. Oxygen dances if you let it. His mind was part science, part sorcery. He didn't just mix chemicals. He tuned them, balancing ratios like a musician striking chords, waiting for the perfect vibration that made the engine hum like a living creature. And the results spoke louder than any report could. The first official combat mission using the mix changed everything. A squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy, powerful, but sluggish at high altitudes, was assigned to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Intelligence suggested enemy fighters would intercept them at 28,000 feet, an altitude where the big radial engines gasped for air. On paper, they wouldn't make it. But in the hangars, under the flickering light, the mechanic had been preparing something special. Each P-47 had been fed his mix, each engine tuned to perfection. The pilots didn't fully understand what they were flying with, only that the mechanic had warned them. When she starts to scream, don't pull back. That's her singing. The mission began in silence, the sky an ocean of gray-blue above the bombers. Then, right on schedule, the enemy came. Messerschmitts diving from the sun, cannons flashing, contrails slicing through the thin air. The Thunderbolts throttled up, and that's when the mix came alive. Pilots later said it felt like being punched in the chest. The sudden surge, the gut-twisting acceleration as the aircraft lunged forward like a predator unleashed. The gauges spun, engines howled, and the air shimmered around their wings from the heat. They climbed, not sluggishly, not straining, but with the effortless rise of something born for altitude. Within seconds, the altitude gap was closed. The enemy's advantage disappeared, their formation breaking as the American fighters rose to meet them on equal ground. Dogfights erupted in the thin air, propellers slicing clouds into ribbons, tracer fire lighting up the sky. The German pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. Thunderbolts matching their speed, even overtaking them. For years, the Luftwaffe had laughed at the Americans' heavy fighters, calling them flying anvils. But now, those anvils danced. The mechanics' fuel mix burned so efficiently that exhaust trails thinned into near invisibility, making the fighters ghosts against the sunlight. Radio chatter was chaos, disbelief, exhilaration, panic. One pilot shouted, "I'm keeping up with them! I'm keeping up!" Another reported firing bursts so close that the heat from his own guns melted the enemy's canopy. When the battle ended, not one bomber had been lost. The squadron returned to base with minimal damage, their engines still growling, hot but intact. Word spread like wildfire. The reports reached command centers, then laboratories, then the halls of policy. And just as quickly, the questions began. Who authorized this? Who allowed an untested, unapproved chemical to be used in combat? When they tried to trace it back, they found only the mechanic's name scrawled in a maintenance ledger and an empty desk where he'd once worked. He'd vanished again, leaving behind nothing but a few jars of unidentified liquid and a legend that could no longer be contained. Pilots began calling it lightning fuel. Some said it was divine. Others swore it was cursed. But all agreed, and it worked. Soon, chemists in official facilities tried to replicate it, armed with every instrument, every controlled environment science could offer. Yet somehow they failed. Their mixtures detonated too early or burned too slow. None achieved the same miraculous ratio. The secret wasn't just in the ingredients. It was in the feel. The mechanic's genius lay in understanding the intangible, how combustion wasn't a process, but a conversation between metal, pressure, and will. His apprentices, young engineers who watched in awe as he worked, said he never measured precisely. He'd tilt a beaker, sniff the fumes, and say, "Too proud, needs humility," before adding a few drops of something else. It sounded insane, but it worked every single time. Then came the breaking point, a secret project codenamed WWII. Intelligence reports warned that the enemy was developing high-altitude interceptors that could climb faster than anything the Allies had. Command gave a quiet directive: match it or die trying. They brought the mechanic in from obscurity, gave him resources, assistance, and access to high-octane stocks from every depot in Europe. For the first time, he wasn't working alone. But collaboration wasn't his language. He argued with officers, tore up paperwork, and bypassed safety protocols. When warned that his experiments violated combustion limits, he replied, "Limits are just another word for fear." The breakthrough came not from a new ingredient, but from a mistake. One night, as storms rolled across the airfield, lightning struck the hangar's fuel storage. The blast nearly leveled the structure. But among the wreckage, the mechanic noticed something extraordinary. The rain had mixed with exposed fuel, diluting it, altering its chemical signature. The mixture burned slower, cooler, but denser, allowing for sustained high-pressure ignition. He spent the next week recreating that accident deliberately, fine-tuning the ratio until he found the perfect storm between volatility and endurance. The result was staggering. Engines treated with the new mix ran smoother at high altitudes, produced fewer detonations, and delivered raw thrust without meltdown. It wasn't just about speed anymore. It was about control, the ability to maintain impossible performance safely. When the new mixture was tested on a P-51 Mustang fitted for long-range escort, the results shattered expectations. The plane not only climbed faster, it endured longer. Missions that once required mid-air refueling or dangerous landings on forward strips could now reach deep into enemy heartlands and return safely. The mechanic stood by the runway as the Mustang returned from a record-breaking sortie, the pilot leaping out, helmet in hand, shouting, "You've made her immortal!" That day, the mechanic didn't smile. He just stared at the sky, whispering, "Immortal's a dangerous word." But the real storm was coming. The success of WWII brought both fame and fear. Laboratories wanted formulas, governments wanted control, and rival nations wanted espionage. The mechanic was summoned to Washington under armed escort, briefed in classified chambers, and asked to surrender his notes. He refused. "You can take my notebooks," he said, "but you'll never take what's not written." The room fell silent. They realized they weren't dealing with a scientist. They were dealing with a force of nature, a man who had become the embodiment of his own creation, volatile, explosive, untamable. Yet even as bureaucracy closed in, war waited for no one. Across oceans, another front was opening, the Pacific, where brutal dogfights over vast blue expanses demanded range, endurance, and altitude like never before. When carrier pilots began whispering about a new mix being tested in the tropics, the legend resurfaced. "He's back," they said, "and he's brought the storm with him." The Pacific was a different kind of battlefield. Not a land of borders and trenches, but an endless, shimmering sea that swallowed distance, men and machines alike. A horizon that always seemed to promise salvation, yet hid death beneath every cloud. Here, in this vastness, engines mattered more than ever, because there was no soft landing, no backup, no second chance. Either your plane got you home or the ocean did. That's why the arrival of the mechanic's fuel was greeted not with skepticism, but with desperate hope. The pilots of the Pacific Theater had already seen too many of their comrades vanish over blue infinity, their tanks empty, their engines sputtering into silence just miles short of safety. So when whispers spread that a new fuel mix could give their fighters range enough to escort bombers all the way to Japan and back, the reaction was visceral. Commanders didn't care if it broke regulations. They wanted results, and the mechanic, now half legend, half myth, appeared again like a ghost stepping out of an oil-slick mirage. His arrival on the island was understated. No fanfare, no salute, just the low rumble of a transport unloading crates that reeked of chemicals and ambition. He didn't look like the savior they expected. Sunburned, sleepless, and carrying only a dented notebook and a single wrench, he walked straight to the airstrip, touched the nose of a waiting Hellcat, and murmured, "Let's see if you can sing in this heat." The Pacific humidity was cruel to engines. Moisture clogged carburetors, corroded fittings, warped precision. Yet where others saw mechanical limits, the mechanic saw opportunity. Moist air burns differently, he told his reluctant assistants. It's like a drunk man, unpredictable, but strong if you guide him right. That night, under red-filtered lights, he began mixing the new iteration of his fuel, a volatile blend of alcohol, high-octane gasoline, and stabilizers that he measured not with instruments, but with intuition. Pilots watched, fascinated, as he stirred the shimmering liquid with a rod, whispering under his breath, as though speaking to the fuel itself. When one officer asked for the chemical ratios, he just smiled and said, "If you need to measure it, you don't understand it." By dawn, the first tests began. A Hellcat, its engine filled with the mechanic's blend, roared down the makeshift coral runway and shot into the sky like a missile, climbing higher and faster than any pilot on that island had ever seen. The exhaust burned almost clear, with only faint traces of blue flame, hotter, cleaner, and unnervingly smooth. As the pilot banked into a tight loop, he radioed down in disbelief. "She's not climbing. She's leaping." Below, mechanics and officers stared at the gauges, eyes wide as temperatures stayed stable even as the RPMs broke known limits. When the plane touched down, the pilot stepped out shaking, his hands trembling not from fear but from exhilaration. "It's not an engine anymore," he said quietly. "It's alive!" That one test changed the war's rhythm. Within weeks, select fighter squadrons were retrofitted to use the mechanics blend. Each operation stamped top secret experimental. The new fuel allowed longer patrols, faster climbs, and brutal acceleration during intercepts. Suddenly, Japanese Zero pilots, once feared for their agility and speed, found themselves outmatched by American aircraft that seemed to rewrite the rules of flight. Engagement reports came back with words that sounded almost mythical. Hellcats overtook enemy formation in vertical climb. Corsairs reached combat altitude in half the time. Engine temperatures nominal after prolonged. Throttle. It was as though gravity itself had been outsmarted. The Japanese, confused by these new capabilities, suspected new engine designs or even radical aircraft modifications. But the truth was far simpler and more terrifying. It wasn't the metal that changed. It was the fire inside it. The mechanics formula had become the soul of these machines, a force multiplier that pushed American air power to near supernatural levels. But power, as always, came with a price. The mixture was volatile, demanding respect and precision. One drop too much methanol, 1 degree too high in ambient temperature, and the fuel could vaporize mid-flight. The mechanic drilled his crews relentlessly, teaching them to listen, not just read. "Engines talk," he would say, "and they scream before they die." Then came the night that sealed his legend. Intelligence intercepted reports of a massive Japanese convoy, troop transports, cruisers, and carriers moving under the cover of a storm toward an Allied stronghold. Air support was limited. Refueling options, none. Distance, too far for standard missions? The brass said it couldn't be done. The mechanic said, "We'll make the sky shorter." In the torrential rain, he worked with his team, hands shaking as lightning flashed across the horizon, each strike illuminating faces drenched in sweat and determination. They mixed the last of their chemicals by hand, rationing it between the planes like lifeblood. One pilot approached him quietly and asked, "What if it burns too hot this time?" The mechanic looked up, eyes cold and alive at once, and replied, Then you fly faster than the fire. The mission launched at dawn, a formation of Hellcats and Avengers streaking into a bruised sky, the ocean below a writhing mirror of storm and foam. The mechanic stood on the runway, soaked and motionless, watching until the last dot vanished into the horizon. Hours later, the radio crackled. Targets sighted. Engaging. What followed was chaos. Tracer rounds lighting the clouds, thunder mixing with explosions, the sea boiling beneath waves of fire. Pilots reported unimaginable performance. Climbs through storm turbulence, dives through sheets of lightning, engines roaring like gods unchained. The fuel had given them wings beyond reason. By the end, the convoy was in ruins, several ships burning, others retreating under smoke and flame. But the cost was high. A few planes never returned, vanishing into the storm's throat. No wreckage ever found. When the survivors landed, their planes smoking, their faces pale and hollow, the mechanic approached in silence. One pilot stepped forward, eyes wet, voice shaking. It worked. But we lost Carter. He went up like a star. The mechanic's jaw tightened. Stars don't die, he said. They burn so others can see. Then, without another word, he walked back into the hangar and began cleaning his tools. He didn't celebrate. He didn't rest. He just worked, as though trying to keep death at bay through motion. But even as victory spread through command channels, the higher-ups grew uneasy. They saw not just a triumph of innovation, but a dangerous independence. The mechanic's formula wasn't documented, wasn't controllable, and worst of all, it wasn't theirs. Rumors circulated that the military would seize his research and reassign him. Some said he was ordered to replicate his results under laboratory conditions. Others claimed he was interrogated by intelligence officers demanding the exact chemical ratios. But when they searched his quarters, they found nothing. His notes, his samples, even his mixing rods, all gone. What remained was a single inscription scratched into a steel workbench. The sky doesn't belong to orders. After that, he disappeared once more. No forwarding address, no trace. Some claimed to have seen him in the Philippines fixing fighter engines for rum. Others swore he went north working on racing planes in secret hangars. But the truth was probably simpler. He was done. The war had consumed him, his creation, and perhaps his soul. Yet his legacy refused to fade. Every mechanic, every engineer who touched an aircraft after that carried a piece of his rebellion, the belief that machines could transcend their limits if only humans dared enough. Years later, as peace returned and the age of jets began, a group of engineers at Wright Field examined an old fuel sample recovered from a wrecked Hellcat. The composition baffled them. Ratios didn't make sense. Components were chemically unstable by known standards, yet perfectly balanced in the sample. One young chemist, staring at the strange amber liquid, whispered, "It shouldn't work." His superior smiled grimly and said, "That's exactly why it did." The mechanic was never honored publicly. His name was buried in technical archives, redacted from reports, whispered only in maintenance hangars and among old pilots who still remembered the smell of his mix. Sharp, sweet, dangerous, like power-bottled and waiting to explode. But his legend grew louder than his silence. To the pilots who'd flown on his fuel, he wasn't a man. He was the embodiment of defiance, proof that human ingenuity could outpace bureaucracy, that courage could rewrite chemistry, and that sometimes, to win, you had to light the sky on fire and fly through it. And somewhere, beyond the static of history, the mechanic's words lingered, carried in the hum of every engine that dared to go faster than it should. In the shimmer of heat over every runway where men still dream of flight. Engines don't burn fuel. They burn belief. The war machine had grown monstrous by 1944. Factories that never slept, oceans that never calmed, and skies that no longer belonged to birds. Yet amid the thunder of bombers and the shriek of dive sirens, it was still the small things, the hidden tweaks, the unseen hands, that made all the difference between domination and disaster. The mechanic's fuel had become a ghost in the system. It wasn't officially listed on manifests, wasn't recorded in supply logs, but it kept appearing, under different designations, shipped in plain drums, smuggled through logistics lines by officers who swore by its results. Pilots called it angel's blood. The brass called it unauthorized innovation. But everyone knew. It worked. Now, with Allied forces pushing deeper into enemy territory, that invisible advantage was about to determine the fate of entire fleets. The skies over the Marianas were a furnace that summer. Japanese fighters, desperate, determined, and deadly, filled the air like hornets protecting their hive. American bombers lumbered through the inferno, heavy with payloads destined for the industrial heart of the empire. Their escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, were fast, but not fast enough. Range had always been the enemy. It was the invisible wall that stopped victory just short of total. But that wall was about to crumble. The mechanics' formula, whispered from one airfield to another, now powered a handful of experimental squadrons. They called themselves the Blazers, and their insignia, a flaming wrench crossed with wings, wasn't regulation, but nobody dared to remove it. These were pilots who believed in the impossible because they had flown it. Their missions were brutal. Long-range escorts through weather that ate metal, fuel stretched to the edge of physics, enemy fighters swarming like shadows that refused to die. But the fuel's strange magic, its balance of power and stability, gave them something no training could: control in chaos. One pilot, Captain Elias Monroe, described it best in a post-war interview that was later censored. You'd throttle up, and it didn't feel like acceleration. It felt like time slowed down. You could sense every piston, every molecule burning in harmony. You weren't flying a plane, you were the plane. His words would have sounded poetic, if not for what followed. It scared me because I realized that something that powerful shouldn't exist. The Japanese quickly noticed. Dogfights that should have ended in stalemates turned into massacres. American fighters dived steeper, climbed faster, evaded longer. The enemy intelligence branch nicknamed them Kaminari Oni, thunder demons, and feared them as omens of unstoppable vengeance. But with great speed came dangerous temptation. Some pilots pushed their engines too far, believing themselves invincible, only to vanish in midair. No explosion, no wreckage, just gone. The mechanics' formula, it seemed, gave not just speed, but something darker: unpredictability. It was rumored that under extreme strain, the mixture could superheat combustion chambers beyond metallurgical limits. "You'll burn brighter," the mechanic had once said, but only once. Still, command couldn't argue with results. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw the Blazers perform maneuvers that left even their allies speechless. Fighters climbed through the clouds and dove out of the sun with precision so uncanny that it seemed choreographed by gods. In one mission report, Lieutenant Rawlings recorded something that defied explanation. "We were outnumbered 6-1. I should have died, but I didn't. I felt like the plane was reading my thoughts. I wanted left. It turned before my hand moved. I wanted climb. It lifted before I touched the throttle. That's not engineering. That's something else." After the battle, wreckage analysis showed something shocking. Engine blocks from the fuel-enhanced planes displayed microscopic crystal patterns in the metal, almost as if the heat had rearranged their molecular structure. Metallurgists called it impossible. The mechanic would have called it expected. "Heat teaches," he'd said once. "Metal learns." The engineers studying the remains tried replicating it, but their lab blends failed, either too unstable to ignite or too weak to perform. Whatever the mechanic had done, he'd done it by instinct, and instinct couldn't be bottled. Then came the visit. A group of high-ranking officers, men who carried more authority than names, arrived at the island base. Their insignia gleamed, Their faces didn't. They wanted the mechanic found. "His creation," one officer said coldly, "belongs to the United States government." The pilots said nothing. One by one they were questioned, their logbooks seized, their samples confiscated. But none revealed the full truth. Some claimed ignorance, others feigned forgetfulness, but they all knew if the mechanic's formula became property of bureaucracy, it would die behind classified walls, dissected until it lost its soul. Yet even legends can't escape war forever. The next mission, codenamed Vanguard, was supposed to be routine, a strike on supply convoys near Okinawa. But something went wrong. The enemy had learned. Hidden anti-aircraft batteries, radar-guided and coordinated, turned the sky into a lattice of death. Pilots who'd survived countless engagements now found themselves in a killing zone with no exit. One by one, planes fell, until Captain Monroe, leading the last formation, realized they had one chance: climb through the barrage and dive on the guns. But at that altitude, with that maneuver, fuel consumption would normally cripple the mission. Normal fuel, yes, but this wasn't normal. Monroe throttled to the red line, the engine howling as if alive, and shouted over the comms, "Let's burn the sky itself!" They did. The climb was suicidal. Heat gauges hit maximum. The smell of ozone filled cockpits, and flames licked from exhausts as if the planes were breaking through dimensions. But the fuel held. It roared, expanded, twisted physics until even gravity seemed to hesitate. They punched through the barrage, rolled inverted, and plunged like meteors. The bombs hit perfectly, detonating the entire anti-air network in a chain of blinding white fire visible for miles. The blast wave tossed debris across the ocean, and when the smoke cleared, Monroe's voice crackled faintly through static. "Targets destroyed, engines holding..." Then silence. They never found his plane. Only a faint oil slick, shimmering gold and blue in the sun, like a rainbow spilled over death. Some said it was the fuel itself, burning one last time. Others said he ascended, that his machine had become something beyond metal, beyond war. The mechanic's formula disappeared again soon after, buried under new regulations, its existence denied, its creator written off as a myth. But the pilots who'd known him, who'd flown on his fire, knew better. They carried fragments of the truth, fragments that would echo in the design of post-war jets, in classified projects where engineers tried to mimic that impossible performance and failed again and again. In 1946, when the first American jet squadrons began testing prototype fuels, one engineer stumbled on a sealed canister marked only with a hand-scrawled H. Inside was a pale amber liquid that emitted faint vapor trails when exposed to light. Lab results were inconclusive. Chemical signatures didn't match any known compound. But when a drop was poured into a prototype turbojet chamber, the RPM surged by 18% before the engine shattered its casing. The report vanished the next day. The engineer resigned, and the canister, like the man who'd made it, was never seen again. The legend of the mechanic became a ghost story told to rookies in hangars, a warning about power and obsession. "Don't chase the fire," old pilots would say. "It doesn't like being caught." But there was reverence, too, because deep down, they all knew that everything flying above Mach 1, every afterburner, every supercompressed turbojet that screamed against the atmosphere, owed its lineage to that nameless man who had once stirred his mix under a canvas tent and told an engine to dream harder. Years later, when the Smithsonian began restoring a surviving Hellcat from the Pacific, they discovered residue in its tanks that modern instruments couldn't analyze, elements that didn't align with any post-war fuel. The curator wrote in his log, "It shouldn't have worked." And yet, the museum director, an old Navy vet who'd flown one of those birds, smiled and said, "That's exactly the point. It did." And so, even as history tried to bury him, the mechanic lived on in the unseen, in the roar of jet, engines that still defy the limits of chemistry, in the whisper of exhaust as aircraft break the sound barrier, in every daring pilot who pushes a throttle just a little past the red line and feels that pulse of something ancient and defiant. It isn't science, it isn't madness. It's the same alchemy that once turned gasoline and willpower into lightning. They say legends fade, but legends made of flame don't fade. They burn forever, carried in the hearts of those who dare to defy what's written, who hear an engine scream and answer back, not yet. And somewhere, far from the pages of history, under a rusting hangar by the sea, perhaps there still sits a man with oil on his hands and a glint in his eye, staring at the horizon and whispering to a silent machine. Let's see if you can sing again. By late 1944, the war had begun to devour itself. Machines that once seemed unbeatable were now outdated overnight, and skies that once belonged to one side became killing grounds for both. Yet hidden beneath the thunder of combat was a quieter, more dangerous race, not of guns or armor, but of ideas. Engineers, chemists, and pilots were all trying to cheat the same enemy, limitation itself. The mechanics' mysterious fuel mixture had already changed the rhythm of the air war, but now the secret was spreading, morphing, mutating, whispered through maintenance crews, copied in half-remembered ratios, reborn in labs that didn't officially exist. Each new attempt pushed the boundary further, and with each flight, the laws of physics groaned a little louder under the strain. Pilots returned from missions dazed, describing speeds and climbs their instruments couldn't confirm. Some claimed their altimeters froze mid-maneuver. Others swore the horizon bent when they throttled past redline. Scientists dismissed the accounts as combat fatigue. But to the pilots, it felt like touching something forbidden. A door cracked open between what was possible and what shouldn't be. The Allies called it Project Prometheus, a classified initiative buried under fuel efficiency research. The goal was to reproduce the mechanics' blend under controlled conditions, but every test ended in contradiction. Engines ran smoother but hotter. Thrust increased but consumption dropped. It made no sense. It's as if, one report stated, the combustion process is anticipatory. The phrase was struck out in later drafts. By November, Prometheus units were quietly attached to select long-range fighter groups in the Pacific. Their results were immediate and terrifying. Planes that should have stalled at high altitude instead sliced upward like knives through glass. Dogfights turned into physics experiments, vectors twisting, contrails looping back on themselves, pilots blacking out under forces that should have torn wings apart. One mission became legend, Operation Typhoon Edge, a desperate escort of B-29s bound for Formosa through a typhoon wall so dense that radar couldn't penetrate it. It was supposed to be suicide, but a dozen Mustangs running the new Prometheus mix volunteered anyway. Radio transcripts from that night still exist, fractured, ghostly. Visibility 0. Instruments unreliable. Maintaining heading by lightning flashes. Then silence. Hours later, the bombers emerged on the far side, untouched. The fighters were there, circling like guardians. Their fuel readings showed impossible endurance, 3 hours beyond expected range. When they landed, ground crews found something even stranger. The exhaust ports were lined with crystalline deposits, shimmering like frost, though the metal was searing hot. Samples were taken. The deposits evaporated within minutes. In Washington, the results triggered panic and fascination in equal measure. Was this science, sorcery, or sabotage? Orders came down to halt all field use until full analysis could be done. But war doesn't wait for caution. Commanders on the front lines ignored the directive, citing operational necessity. The mechanic's ghost now had a bureaucracy chasing it and men willing to die for it. The line between innovation and obsession blurred completely. One colonel famously said, "We're not fighting the Japanese anymore when we're fighting the rules that say this shouldn't work." And for a while, they won. Air superiority became absolute. The new fuel allowed higher takeoff weights, longer loiter times, and split-second thrust bursts that could turn an ambush into a massacre. Engineers began modifying turbochargers and carburetors to accommodate it, creating hybrid engines that seemed half alive, engines that learned, adjusted, adapted mid-flight. But victory has a cost measured in silence. By January 1945, reports of mechanical ghosting began surfacing. Engines that continued to run seconds after shutoff, props spinning long after ignition was cut, as though the planes themselves refused to stop. One test pilot, Major Caldwell, described landing with all gauges, dead yet feeling the aircraft still pulling forward, like it had a heartbeat of its own. The technicians laughed until they couldn't explain. The scorch marks that formed on the hangar floor, in the pattern of exhaust plumes, except the engines were cold. The next morning, the Mustang's fuel tanks were empty, bone dry. No leaks, no traces, just gone. The fuel had vanished like breath on glass. Then came the incident at Leyte Gulf. A formation of experimental fighters was scrambled to intercept incoming bombers at dawn. Mid-flight, their comms filled with distortion, shrieking feedback, voices overlapping in impossible frequencies. Ground radar tracked them climbing past operational ceiling, then arcing into cloud cover. Only one returned. The pilot was incoherent, trembling, his flight suit scorched in odd geometric patterns. He swore he saw lightning inside his canopy, crawling across the glass like veins. His report ended with a single line. "It saw me back." Command scrubbed the mission logs, sealed the wreckage, and quietly moved Prometheus under the jurisdiction of a new intelligence branch, one that didn't officially exist until decades later. Meanwhile, the war ended, at least on paper. But the ghosts of the mechanics' creation lingered. The surviving Prometheus aircraft were shipped home, stripped for analysis, and scrapped under orders of safety disposal. Yet fragments found their way into the post-war jet program, fuel stabilizers, injection ratios, the concept of staged detonation. Every time a test pilot pushed past a new barrier, they were unknowingly flying on the shoulders of a man whose name had been erased. And every so often a test flight would end mysteriously. Engines over-revving, instruments blinking out, jets gliding home on fumes that shouldn't have existed. The engineers called these anomalies flare echoes. Old pilots called them the mechanic's handshake. In 1947, when the Bell X-1 broke the sound barrier, its pilot, Chuck Yeager, described a split-second calm before the shockwave, a hush that felt like the sky was holding its breath. In the audience, an aging Navy engineer smiled. He recognized that silence. He'd heard it once before, the night he tested a strange golden fuel on an airstrip that no longer existed. The report was never filed, but in his personal notes, found decades later, he'd written one haunting line: "When you fly with fire that thinks, don't be surprised when it starts to dream." And so, as the jet age dawned, as humanity traded propellers for afterburners, the shadow of that insane fuel trick remained, a myth whispered among those who worked too close to the red line. Some said the mechanics formula had been rediscovered in secret labs. Others swore it was gone forever, burned away in the crucible of war. Yet every time a pilot feels that impossible surge, when the plane leaps forward as if gravity forgot its duty, perhaps that's his legacy, the echo of a man who refused to accept the limits of chemistry, who believed that fire itself could be convinced to fly. Because in the end, that's what it was never about fuel. It was about belief. The belief that rules were suggestions, that fear was optional, and that somewhere, hidden between air and combustion, there was a secret waiting to be coaxed into light. And when the engines screamed and the sky tore open, those who dared to listen could almost hear a whisper rising from the exhaust, a single defiant word: again. As the war drew to its close and the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years, a strange silence settled across the airfields that once roared with engines and ambition. The fighters that had once defied physics now sat motionless, their wings heavy with the dust of history, their propellers still, like monuments to the madness that had once burned through the veins of men and machines alike. The mechanic who'd birthed the impossible fuel had long vanished into rumor. Some said he was absorbed into a secret government lab. Others whispered he was found dead in a workshop filled with shattered canisters and scorch marks that refused to cool. But his legacy remained, not in medals or records, but in whispers among the few who had flown with that fuel burning in their engines. They said the mixture wasn't just chemistry, it was alive, reacting not just to air and pressure, but to will itself, to the intent of the man behind the stick. It gave back what the pilot demanded: strength, speed, fury, but always at a price. The survivors would tell you that price wasn't their lives, it was their peace. In the years that followed, the Air Force dismantled what little documentation existed. Lab reports were incinerated. Test notes were rewritten to omit the impossible results. Yet every time engineers gathered to test new fuels or push propulsion tech further, anomalies crept back in. Inexplicable surges. Efficiency spikes no one could replicate. Combustion curves that looked eerily familiar. Some veterans, long retired, would receive letters stamped with no return address. Fragments of old blueprints, formulas written in shorthand, pages that smelled faintly of jet fuel and ozone. Most burned them without reading. A few didn't. One young propulsion researcher in 1951 took those pages and used them to prototype a new high-octane blend. His superiors called it a miracle compound. They didn't know it traced directly back to the mechanics' experiments. That fuel would later power the earliest Cold War jet interceptors. Aircraft that could touch the edge of the stratosphere, briefly vanish from radar and return without explanation. Pilots began calling those planes ghosts. They said sometimes, if you throttled just right, if you pushed the afterburner past its tolerance, you'd hear something. A second tone under the roar, a pulse out of rhythm, as if the engine had remembered the past. "It's like it wants to keep going," one test pilot said after nearly blacking out during a vertical climb. "Like it doesn't care about gravity anymore." The analysts dismissed him, of course, but quietly, a few wondered. Could fire remember? Could combustion itself evolve? The question hung over the labs like a storm cloud. The official stance remained silence. The unofficial one? Curiosity wrapped in fear. Decades later, during the space race, a fragment of that same formula was rediscovered in a sealed archive, mislabeled as obsolete wartime research. NASA's early rocket teams studied it briefly, then buried it again after a test stand exploded in a way that defied explanation, fuel consumption dropping after ignition, thrust increasing beyond theoretical maximum. The event was logged as instrument error, but one engineer, older than the rest, recognized the signature. "It's him," he muttered, staring at the telemetry. "He's still out there, somewhere in the numbers." By the 1970s, jet technology had long surpassed propeller-driven fighters, yet whispers of the thinking fuel refused to die. Pilots in experimental craft, SR-71s, X-planes, black projects that didn't exist on paper, would joke about feeding the fire before takeoff, a phrase passed down through generations of airmen. None of them knew it came from that long-ago mechanic, the man who once stared at an engine coughing its last on a Pacific airstrip and decided it simply wasn't enough. They were repeating a ghost's mantra without knowing it. And every now and then, an incident would remind the world how thin the line was between mastery and madness. A test jet vanishing from radar, reappearing 40 miles away. Flight data showing momentary negative drag. Combustion trails forming fractal shapes in midair before dispersing. All written off, all denied, all recorded in the classified appendices of human possibility. And then, years later, when the last of the WWII veterans were old and frail, one of them, a Mustang pilot from the Prometheus missions, was invited to a museum dedication for historic aviation innovations. He walked with a cane, his medals long tarnished, but when he stood before a restored P-51, his hands trembled. The exhibit plaque said nothing of Prometheus, nothing of the mechanic, nothing of the impossible. But as he leaned in, he saw something no one else noticed, faint scorch lines along the engine cowling, identical to the crystalline burns he'd seen decades ago. He smiled, tears forming, and whispered, "Still here, huh? The air around him seemed to shift, as if the room itself exhaled. He told no one what he felt in that moment. The warmth, the hum, the faint vibration of something waiting just beyond understanding. Because maybe that was the truth all along. The insane fuel wasn't just a mixture of chemicals. It was a message, a reminder that limits exist only until someone is desperate enough to break them. The mechanic hadn't cheated physics. He had negotiated with it. He'd found the seam where the impossible hides, and for one brief blazing moment in history, he'd pried it open. And though his formula was lost, its echo lived on in every afterburner, every sonic boom, every impossible flight that defied reason. It was the whisper beneath the thunder, the soul of invention itself. As night fell over the museum, the old pilot looked up through the skylight at the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity's newest machines were slicing through the upper atmosphere, flames trailing behind them, still chasing that same dream, to go faster, higher, further. And if you listened closely, above the hum of engines and the heartbeat of machines, you might just hear it. The faint sound of laughter, the kind only a mechanic who outwitted the laws of nature could make. A laugh that said, "I told you it would fly."